Hello and welcome to another episode of the Curious Mind podcast. My name is Gabriel Ellis. The topic today is anxiety, therapy, and personal responsibility. To give you a little bit of a background, according to statistics, depending on which statistics you look at, about 9 to 15% of Europeans suffer from specific anxiety disorders, while around 5% are confronted with a generalized anxiety or existential fears at some point in their lives. So, this is a quite significant number at any given time of people suffering from some form of anxiety. And this is actually not a big surprise because anxiety is one of the most fundamental experiences of being human, whether it is the fear of a baby and its utter helplessness, the fear of heights, which is relatively trivial, or deeper fears of what comes from within us, or existential fears of, for example, being alone or in an insignificant life. Anxieties are and have always been part of our existence since birth. The question is how we deal with them. At some point, most of us do reach a point when we have to find a new way of dealing with the anxieties of life, because otherwise we try to apply the old methods that we have picked up during our lifetime, that we try to imitate, and this becomes just exhausting if it doesn't work. Then more and more headspace, more and more cognitive energy is wasted on compensating for the anxieties that we cannot resolve in a satisfying way. Another way that people go about it, and especially today, I feel that this is something that has become quite popular, is to suppress anxieties. The consequence of that is that we become numb inside, we lose contact with ourselves and with our life. So the success of this strategy of suppression comes at a high cost. And this is something that one of the most fundamental existential philosophers and psychologists, Friedrich Nietzsche, mentioned in this quote from Human All Too Human. Here goes the quote: "If you have used your mind to master the excess of your emotions, your affects, you may end up transferring the excess to your mind and going wild in your thinking and desire to know." What he means with that is when we have mastered kind of the irrational aspects of our emotions, which in our example is anxieties, it might lead to become excessive in our control. And when we have become excessive in our control, we have lost touch with being human itself, with the energy of being human, with our vitality, with our force to be alive. And this is something that people like Nietzsche have stood up in a quite distinct way against. Anxieties can be roughly divided into three categories. The first category is, like I mentioned, specific fears, such as phobias. And these can be often clearly defined, and they can be overcome through targeted interventions, for example, with behavioral therapy. The second category of anxieties is the fear of inner parts, the fear of myself, of parts of myself. And this requires more self responsibility, more sensitivity within myself. And the therapy is a trusted reflection. I have to use my mind as a sounding board, as a resonance. And this is much more subtle and more complex than just to get rid of specific phobias. And the third category is more existential fears, such as the fear of death, for example, or the fear of utter loneliness. And this affects our deepest self. And it requires a high degree of reflection and of taking responsibility of myself for myself. The therapy on such a level is less characterized through a difference in kind of knowledge and expertise. A therapy on this existential level is much more characterized by being on the same level where the clients and the therapist support each other in equal reflection. Let me first describe the approaches to specific fears. For specific anxieties, such as the fear of heights, for example, or social anxiety, Like I mentioned, cognitive behavioral therapy can be quite effective. So, for example, a person with a social anxiety who is gradually through the therapy encouraged to master social situations through exposure therapy. What is exposure therapy? It has two components. The first is that I expose myself to the circumstances that trigger the fear inside of me. For example, social situations, for example, to meet people on a casual basis, not knowing how I come off, being concerned about the consequences of maybe saying something wrong or awkward. This is something that people with social anxieties often struggle with. So the first component here is I expose myself. I don't avoid. Avoidance, by the way, is always the counterpart, the little sibling of anxiety. And we always have to keep in mind that anxiety can appear through its kind of very palpable and noticeable effects of sweat, and feeling lightheaded, and pulse going up, and so on. But it can be also it can show itself in the form of avoidance of situations like that. So the first component is I'm exposing myself to what makes me actually uncomfortable, but that is not enough because experience has shown that if I just endure the situations and I just push myself to go to social events, for example, to networking events, that I might just really likely to come out of those repeated exposures with little benefit. Why is that? It's because through the exposure, I have avoided to allow the discomfort inside of me to come up. So, for example, people tense their muscles, they hold their breath, they count the time, they imagine that they are well, or in worst case, they drink alcohol or take other meds in order to, as a crutch, to pacify themselves. This does not really work because I have not then really exposed myself to those anxiety-inducing circumstances. What is necessary is that I truly expose myself without any crutch, without tensing up, without hoping that it's soon over. When I do that, then the actual experience, it goes through the unconscious, and the unconscious, which was steering, which was creating the anxiety, the unconscious has to admit that it wasn't as bad as it thought. As long as I control, as long as I tense up, as long as I escape in my mind, I imply to the unconscious that I only survived the situation because of the crutch, because of the meds, because of the alcohol. And so the unconscious can easily keep its attitude towards, for example, social situations, that they are indeed frightening, because if there weren't, why would have you escaped through meds and through alcohol and through tensing up? So again, what is necessary is exposure, and then to relax into the experience and to allow the discomfort to come up, to plateau, and then to go down by itself, proving that the consequences of the frightening events were not as severe as I thought or as the unconscious thought. Now, in a therapeutic context, the therapist who is guiding and instructing the client to go through these situations has a high level of responsibility for the situation. The client has to trust the expertise of the therapist. And of course, they have to take the responsibility of actually letting go in those particular moments, of actually exposing themselves. But just in comparison, there's a high reliance on the expertise and the competence of the therapy in these cases. Let's go to the second category of anxieties, which is the fear of my inside. In these circumstances, these cases, when I'm uncomfortable with what happens to me inside of me when I'm in certain situations, there's less emphasis on the circumstances, and this is the anxiety that comes up is more the result of a long developed habit, a habit, for example, from childhood, but it doesn't have to be from childhood alone. Basically, all important periods of life go through transitional periods, and those transitional periods we are quite vulnerable. So going to school, for example, and opening up from the family situation to other kids, to the authority of teachers, or to go through puberty when we leave the comfort that we have developed with the school situation, with the home situation, and now suddenly the peers are the authorities that judge whether I'm worthy or not. Or then when we leave school or when we leave university and we get our first jobs, there are new authorities that we are vulnerable against because they suddenly decide over our fate. So, in all of those transitional periods, we might pick up habits because all of these circumstances they trigger anxiety and discomfort within us naturally. And depending on how successful those strategies are, we might develop habits of, for example, attacking situations in a certain way, or talking through it with skill, or withdrawing mentally and trying to become invisible. But these habits, they become their own thing within us because we tend to apply them again and again and again in the future. And because we leave them untouched and we want them to continue to serve our purposes, they remain an alien aspect within ourselves. And this alien aspect will spawn feelings and its own discomforts over time. So this can then manifest with the years as anxieties that come from within us when we feel alien towards our own inner parts. So the metaphor here is that we are not masters in our own house, and this can be very uncomfortable, especially I think in our day and age, to deal with these situations and with those feelings. Here in the therapeutic context, the expertise of the therapist certainly is helpful, but it requires also a high level of reflection, resonance, and responsibility from the clients. Because they have to understand where exactly the discomfort is, to seek the inner discomfort, and again, to go through the stages of understanding and allowing it to be so that they can eventually integrate those alienated aspects within themselves into the big self, if you will, and to heal as a consequence. The third category of anxieties is existential fears. When it comes to such existential fears, like, for example, the fear of meaninglessness, there are no hacks and quick solutions possible, regardless of what, for example, self-help literature or videos and so on might suggest to you. This level of anxiety goes to our core. We have to confront ourselves with aspects of our core being, with the fact that we are thrown into life, as, for example, philosophers like Heidegger emphasized, we're thrown into the circumstances without being asked. And because we are thrown into them and still have to live, the consequence philosophically is that we have to be aware and be responsible for the freedom that is given to us. The philosopher Sartre, here's a quote from him based on this being thrown into the world. He said, "Man is condemned to freedom. Because we are thrown into the situation, we have to decide how we want to respond to this." This understanding has been also the basis for existential or logotherapy, developed by Viktor Frankl. And he based part of his approach on a quote, again, from Nietzsche, as obviously you've seen, he was an existential philosopher. This quote is from Twilight of the Idols, and it goes like this: "If you have your why of life, you get along with almost every how." What that means is that when we understand what our purpose in life is, then it takes care of most of the situations, of all the questions of how we want to deal with those situations in life, of what we should do, because all of these answers, they spring from the fundamental answer of knowing my purpose in life. So all of those existential approaches, they advocate for understanding who we are, what our purpose is, why we are leading our lives, and this will be the the spring, basically, from which the answers to all life's questions are coming from. So, for example, if a person struggles with a fear of old age and frailty, they can begin to rethink their values and where the actual meaning of their life is. The emphasis here is on their life because, on such an existential level, we cannot take blueprints from other people. We cannot copy and paste what other people did in ancient times, for example, or be it Buddhism or whatever it is. It does not work because we have to go back to our core. Yes, our core partly is connected to the core of being human in general, but the solution that we have to find, the purpose that we have to find, is so specifically us that we cannot entrust any other person or any other authority with dealing with this question. So because the risk here to, on that fundamental existential level, to go wrong would be so severe, we have to take the utmost responsibility for those answers, for understanding what the purpose of our lives is. Here are a few strategies for dealing with this existential level or existential fears. One can be to read about those big issues. The idea here is not, again, to copy and paste or just to adopt those solutions of other people, but to get inspired, because this is so unnatural to be in this existential level that it's important to remind myself of the questions that are posed there. It's good to get some hints about how to think about those levels. What problems need to be solved there? What is the purpose of life in terms of what is the logic of thinking about the purpose of life? And these cues we can get from literature. We can also get them from reading biographies of insightful people. Again, not to copy, but just to get an idea of what they dealt with. And we can be sure that when we read this might trigger our own process. So reading, actively dealing with this topic can be quite a valuable approach to our own existential topic. A second strategy, a second approach to achieve this level is honest journaling, where I commit to verbalize topics, to ask myself the question, what is really important to me? To get into the mode and the habit of either in my mind to ask myself these questions or to write them down will be a rich source of material that brings me back again and again to this existential level, and to make it more plausible and more likely that daily events will give me future cues in this puzzle piece to piece together and to live and embody the purpose that I have found over time. So journaling as a practical approach to achieve this existential level over time as a contribution for the puzzle pieces. A third aspect in this practice can be a contemplative practice. This can be classic meditation in the Eastern traditions. It can be Christian contemplations, or it can be contemplations about existential topics that I have picked up from philosophy, but then I look inside. I go inside myself on a, as we say, phenomenological level. What do I actually see? What do I actually find when I go inside myself? Where are the existential levels there? What am I thrown into? How does it feel to be me? Which is a super rich source of material that will help me to build up a foundation for understanding who I am and what my purpose in life is. In this approach, I'm making friends with the finitude of life, with the end of life. I come to terms with that. I perceive it inside myself, inside my mind. I contemplate over the frailty of my body. And these are pieces that come together then to a certainty that shields me effectively from circumstances that I experience in daily life. On all of those three levels, therapy can be quite helpful. be it on a very pragmatic level, where I learn to deal with specific phobias, be it in the inner parts work, which can be psychodynamic, depth psychology, it can be done in Gestalt psychology, for example, or on this existential level. The deeper we go, the more responsibility we, the clients, have to take, and the less we can, the less we should delegate our responsibility to so-called experts, to therapists, to guides, and so forth. So keep that in mind, and maybe this description that I have given you has given you some clues of how do you want to approach your topics. Are you taking enough responsibility for your experiences, for your approaches in life? And if not, what are the missing pieces? What are the missing elements that you want to address, for example, on a more existential level, so that you do get the existential stability that helps you to face the life questions in general? I am interested in helping and supporting my clients on this journey, be it with the expertise on a pragmatic level or as a resonance board on more deeper levels, inner parts work or existential work. You will find a description, you'll find a link in the description to a free session, a getting to know each other discovery call, if you would like to work with me. Other than that, I would be happy if you leave a comment under this video, under this episode, because I am interested about your experiences. I am interested in how you have approached successfully and what you think is the next step in facing and armoring yourself against the uncertainties of life, and with which levels and puzzle pieces you want to do that. I hope to see you next time. All the best.